Hi everyone, welcome to this week's video. This is going to be on environmental impacts on evolution. Now that's going to be what we talk about at the end. We've got a lot to talk about in between, and let's just get started. The objective for this unit is that you will use evidence to show that changes in the environment may result in changes in a species over time. So on that note, I want to talk to you about what that means, and I've put together a little graphic. So this is a simple aerial view of a field. The size actually should be quite a bit larger than it is, but we're just pretending right now, okay? We have a river going down the middle of it. We have some trees on the left, some trees on the right. There are some differences in the trees, and I could just, I basically just picked a color, although the difference could literally be anything. And right here, I'm going to say that we have a flock of birds. Now, this flock of birds just flew here from somewhere else. They've never been here before. What caused them to leave that somewhere else is important, but we'll just make something up. Let's say there was a big fire and it destroyed the entire forest. And so they had to go live somewhere else, okay? So they flew several miles, let's say 25 miles, which for a bird may not seem like a long ways, but in terms of size, that's a long ways for a bird to travel, okay? Now, they are, as you can see, blue with yellow highlights. I don't know how well you can see that, but let's just say they're blue with yellow highlights. And don't make fun of my birds, because it was the only shape I could find, all right? But let's say that some of them flew over here to this tree, this forest, and some of them flew over here to this forest, okay? And so now they're living in two new environments. They came from the same environment. They were the same species. But now that they have moved to two separate environments that are separated far enough that they don't move back and forth, and that's important. It's something called geographic isolation we're going to be talking about soon. But they came from the same environment, so they had adapted to that environment. I don't know, the trees must have been blue or something. But they flew to this environment, and now they're living one population. Now, I want to remind you of the difference here. A population is not a species, okay? In case you don't quite understand this, the species, I want to change the color on that just a little bit. A species, when we say species, we're talking about every single of whatever on Earth. Every single, mockingbird on planet Earth. That's a single species, okay? I can look at a mockingbird and another mockingbird and say they're a member of the same species, right? That you don't divide them any further than species until you start talking about a population. Just because I'm talking about all of the mockingbirds in Passenger, and you should really get more specific than that, but just because I'm talking about all the mockingbirds in Passenger, for instance, this bunch, it doesn't mean I'm talking about all of the mockingbirds. There are mockingbirds in Fort Drum. There are mockingbirds in Buckhead Ridge. There are mockingbirds in Treasure Island. There are mockingbirds on the prairie. There are mockingbirds in Loretta. There are mockingbirds in Lakeport. There are mockingbirds all over the place, right? The difference is usually something is separating them, okay? Now that something might be distance, it might be time, it might be a geographic things such as, not so much for birds, but like a river or who knows, maybe an ocean. But there's usually something separating them. Another example, even though I'm going to go back to birds, would be, let's say, largemouth bass. Now largemouth bass are a singular species, okay? But the largemouth bass living in Lake Okeechobee all have access to each other. However, because of the design of the river and the structures along the river, there are largemouth bass that are in, they call them pools. They've got the river divided into segments, and I don't remember which one's which, but there are largemouth bass in Pool A, largemouth bass in Pool B, Pool C. Then there are largemouth bass in Lake Estapoga, Lake Kissimmee. There are largemouth bass in the pond behind my house. There are largemouth bass that live in Lake Tohopekaliga, up further north, and they're all separated, okay? Now this is important that you understand that they're separated, because separated populations do not interbreed usually. Now if something does happen to leave this population and go to this population, we call that migration, okay? And that can happen even with the bass, but it's not a common thing. For the most part, this population interbreeds, okay? And that's it. So it's important that you understand that I'm usually talking, when I'm talking about the birds here, I'm talking about they came from a population near where the forest fire burned. They came here and they were all the same. They all had the same, they shared the DNA. We talked about that last chapter where we talked about Hardy-Weinberg and how they all had the same ratio of DNA, all right? But now that they moved here, they've actually become two separate populations. I don't know if you see that, okay? But now this is a population, and because the distance from here to here is so big, and you have to pretend with me, I know it's probably not to scale, but let's say that it's so far, okay, that these birds don't normally move from here to here or here. They don't migrate. They now live in this forest, and that's it. That's where they live. And these guys live in this forest, and that's it, and that's where they live. And they are the same species, but evolution suggests that over time, and we are talking about a fairly significantly long amount of time here, depending on what bird or what organisms we're talking about. Bacteria don't take so long, but birds do. And it has to do with how long it takes to have a generation, okay? Generally, it takes 1 to 3 years for birds to have a generation, where bacteria can have a generation in 15 minutes. Humans have a generation in, what, 20 years, okay? But it's the changes from one generation to the next and the adaptations to the environment that is creating this slow change. As it stands right now, this group of birds and this group of birds, and it's inevitable, their DNA will slowly change through adaptation, which doesn't really change their DNA, but it changes the ratio of the DNA of the genes, right? And we talked about that last chapter. But or through flat out mutations. Now remember, mutations can be good or bad depending on the environment they're in. The main difference in these two environments, and this is silly, but you know, you can come up with your own, but I just, using the computer, I came up with the color of the trees. These trees are lighter green than these trees, okay? Now suppose that a bird was born over here that had a mutation. Here's our birds, and we're going to create a whole new baby bird. With me, it's just, hold on, I have to ungroup. But here, this mommy bird and this baby bird, and they create a whole new baby bird. There it is, how cute, right? But this baby bird is an ugly duckling. It's born with darker colored feathers. Now, is that an advantage? If you're nodding your head yes, congratulations. If you're nodding your head no, well, congratulations, but I think you missed it. Take a look at what happened now to this bird. This is a mutation. This is an ugly duckling. This is a freak. All right? But look at the environment. Does it give it an advantage, and why? So this mutation turned out to be a positive mutation. However, let's suppose that poor little baby bird, instead of that mutation being born over here, it was born over here, okay? And now all of a sudden, is that mutation positive or negative? Now, I wouldn't say it's any better off than its parents, who are probably struggling in these trees, but if you'll notice, the mutation, which was such an advantage in the other forest, is not an advantage here, okay? So what do you suppose is going to happen to this baby bird? The parents are struggling because they're pretty easy for predators to find in the trees. The baby bird's going to struggle, so there's no advantage here, right? But what's going to happen to this particular mutation? Will it thrive? Will it appear more and more in the later generations? I would say probably not, because it has no advantage. But put that same mutation over here, same mutation, absolutely random that it happened, absolutely random where it happened, but the same mutation happens here, and guess what? All of a sudden this baby bird has a huge advantage, and it's thriving. It doesn't have to struggle so much because of the fact that it is more camouflaged. It doesn't have to spend a significant portion of its day hiding from predators like its parents do. Therefore, it is more successful at gathering food, it's more successful at surviving, and therefore, what do you suppose when it reproduces with the next generation and it produces its own generation of offspring, there's a greater chance it's going to have what we call higher reproductive success, and as a result, the offspring, there will be more of them colored this way, okay, because that's just how DNA works. The more you reproduce, the greater chance that that mutation is going to be to pass along. And if you give it enough time, guess what will happen to all of these birds? They should eventually, not these parents, these will die, but the offspring, this population of birds should eventually be colored this way, because that's a trait that works better than the first trait, or what we call the wild type trait, and it'll proliferate and it'll spread, okay? And as a result, this entire population of birds will be much more successful. Now notice I keep saying population because this isn't all the birds, is it? It's just that population. And over time, it's not that hard to believe that all of these birds here will turn the same color. And you know, the way mutations work, more than likely all these birds over here will adapt to this color because of the way the mutations work. The mutations will show up. It just seems like it's a natural, magical thing. They will show up. But now all of a sudden, I've got a bunch of birds over here. They were the same color, but now over here they've adapted to this color, and over here they've adapted to this color. Now you're thinking, okay, but they're still the same. They're still the same species. Remember, species. Are they the same species? Absolutely. The only thing that's changed is a slight color of their feathers. They're the same thing. We see this in all kinds of things. I mean, in humans we have multiple skin colors, but we're still the same species. We can reproduce, okay? People of two different ethnicities, that's what we call people of different skin color, can certainly reproduce and have offspring. So we're the same species. So right now all I've got is two populations of birds, the same species, just one's adapted living here and one's adapted living here. That's not evolution. That's just slow change. It is natural selection. Nature selected for the color of these birds to be different, okay? And that's exactly why we have multiple colors of skin in humans, for example, or any species, because the environment in which they lived, our ancestors lived, that was the skin color that was well suited, okay? If you're a dark-skinned person, you probably come from a region, your ancestors come from a region on Earth that had lots of sunlight. If you're a light-skinned person, you probably come from the northern or far southern, but it's northern climates in which was less sunlight. That's just the way it goes. That's all it is, okay? However, here's another difference. Let's get back to the birds, forget humans, okay? If this happens enough, another baby was born with another mutation, and I don't know, it's got a beak that is more well suited to eat the insects that live here, and over here one is born with a different beak that's more well suited to eat the fruit in these trees. Well then again, that trait is going to be passed along with greater frequency. A few generations later, everybody's got the different beaks over here, so now we've got two changes, okay? And that's a change in their DNA. That's a change in the ratio of the amount of alleles that are in there, amount of DNA, the times we see that trait. And eventually, that's two changes, then three, then four. I don't know what they are. Maybe their claws get better, maybe, you know, or whatever you call their little bird feet. Maybe, you know, maybe their wings get bigger or smaller, or maybe they get bigger or smaller, just depending. But over time, because they're isolated, the different adaptations and mutations can build up from here and here, so much so that is hard to believe that after given enough time, and we're talking in this case probably hundreds, maybe thousands of years, that they stay isolated, okay, that this population of birds here has so many differences in their DNA, and this population of birds here has so many differences in their DNA that they no longer can reproduce. And if for some strange reason there was a bunch of other of the original, whatever these were, these blue ones were, from the original spot, maybe they flew somewhere else, if they for some reason show up here, they would be entirely different as well, okay? And so I would have a new species. This is called speciation, and evolution leads to speciation. Natural selection leads to speciation. This is the whole point of evolution, is that it leads to speciation. And not only does it lead to speciation, but it leads to very new and different and diverse species. Evolution creates diversity, and diversity is good. Okay? So here now all of a sudden I have, out of one species, I have 2, possibly even 3 new species produced. And as Darwin's finches, I think they produced 12 different species. Okay? These new species were produced, and now all of a sudden where I had 1 species, now I have 12. Now we have a much greater diversity. What's the value of diversity? I don't know if you remember this or not, but diversity is insurance against change. Suppose one day that a forest fire comes through here and wipes all these out, and there's nowhere else to go. In this case, there was somewhere else to go in the last case, but in this case there's nowhere else to go. These birds will more than likely migrate over here, and these birds will not have the same advantages as the ones that have been living here for thousands of years. And so as a result, more than likely, this species of birds are going to come over here, be less successful, and more than likely go extinct. Okay? But did that mean that all of the birds went extinct? No. So as a result, where we had 1 species and now we have 12 species, if we lose a species to extinction, no big deal, we've got 11 more. The idea here is that if you look around, the earth is beautifully and wonderfully diverse, and it's because of this process called natural selection. And this explains over time how we have all of the different species of everything, all the kingdoms and all the species. And if you really stop and think about it, and this is what Darwin did, is you can come to one conclusion, that if given enough time, if you could really trace these things back and go back to the birds that they came from and see where those birds came from and what changes that happened, and if you had enough time, and we're talking 4.7 billion years, that it's not that hard to believe that all living things are related. They all come from a tree of life, and there's one common trunk that goes all the way back to actually about 3.5 billion years ago. And 3.5 billion years ago, all living things on Earth started with a simple single-celled bacteria. And through time and adaptation and change, one single-celled bacteria species became 2 because they started living in different environments. Then 2 became 4, and 4 became 12, and 12 became 10 billion. And the next thing you know, through slight changes over an incredibly long amount of time, we get all the different diversity that you see on Earth. This is what evolution says, and this is the process by which it basically does. We're about to examine it much more closely, but that's really all it is. Now I want you to remember this as I go through this tutorial. So here are some terms, reproductive isolation and speciation, that I basically just used. Okay, so speciation is the creation of a new species, or 2 or 3, but it's whenever a new species appears, and the opposite of speciation is extinction. So put that in your notes, put that in your head. Speciation and extinction are opposites of each other. Speciation adds new species to the ecosystem, to the world. Evolution removes species from the ecosystem of the world. Okay? Now, this has been going on according to the theory of natural selection, according to what we understand about evolution. This has been going on for billions of years. Okay? We have fossil evidence of a Tyrannosaurus rex, for example. Now, I didn't have to duck my head this morning as I went to my Jeep to go somewhere because of a Tyrannosaurus rex. I'm not worried that if I go outside that there's going to be a Tyrannosaurus rex there to eat me. Why? Because it's gone extinct. And when we look at the fossil record, when we look at the layers and layers and layers of fossils, we see that 99.9% of all species that have ever existed have gone extinct. We find tons of fossil evidence of tons of different species of organisms that no longer exist. 1,000 times more species have existed than exist now. Okay, maybe even more, maybe 10,000 times. I'm not actually sure of the numbers, but this process of extinction suggests that either A, the original Earth was so unbelievably diverse, and we've lost a lot of diversity over the amount of time it's been here, or that there's a continual process of the creation of new species and the extinction of old species. Now, a lot of you may be resisting this idea of evolution. And keep in mind, I taught Sunday school yesterday at church. So I know that a lot of us have a sensitivity to this word evolution. But let's expand our minds for just a minute. Let's allow ourselves to not get caught up in these rules that we're told to have. And let's just say for a minute, if it's just that simple, is it really that hard to believe that species go extinct? No, we've seen evidence of it. Then if species go extinct, but we still have a lot of species, how did we get all these species of trees and birds and fungus and bacteria and whatever? Through a process in which new species are created. Now that's got to make sense. And if new species are created, what process does that? And right now it's called evolution. Right now science believes that they understand pretty well this process of evolution. There are still lots of unanswered questions. There are still lots of things that are difficult to explain, but that's always the case. That's the way science works. So speciation is when evolution, through the process of natural selection that I just explained to you, creates a whole new species. All right? Extinction is when a species is removed. And this constant adding and subtracting of species has been going on for billions of years. So now there's this new idea of speciation. What causes it? We're going to give you lots of examples of what causes speciation. We're going to start out with reproductive isolation. In all cases of evolution, fertility is the key. Okay? The more fertile, the more successfully reproducing you are, the greater chance you have at being successful, of your species sticking around. The less fertile or the less you have at reproductive success, for whatever reason, the greater chance you're going to go extinct. The reason there are no more Tyrannosaurus rexes is something caused them to be reproductively unsuccessful, right? And everything that's gone extinct. And we're going to come up with a lot of things like reproductive isolation. Here are three types of flies: Drosophila melanogaster, Drosophila dentissima, and Drosophila obscura. Okay? Now, what happened, you know how this works. This kind of looks like it's part of this line, but it's not. This is saying this is a speciation event, and this is just drawing a line to it. So don't pretend like this line here is the same as this line here. Okay? But so here's what happened. A long time ago, in a land far, far away, or a galaxy far, far away, there was some kind of a fly. Now, more than likely, because all of these are Drosophila, more than likely this was some kind of Drosophila. But something happened, a speciation event, very similar to what I just explained to you with the birds and the trees. But this speciation event occurred here. All of these things were one species at this point, and then something happened here. And there's all kinds of things that could have happened here. And some of the species, several populations maybe, or one population, went this way and adapted entirely differently and changed so much that they became a whole new species called Drosophila obscura. The rest of the species went this way, okay? And they may have stayed the same until there was another speciation event. And by the way, this could have been, like for example, melanogaster. This could have been melanogaster. It's possible that melanogaster hasn't changed over time, but these two branched off, or that whatever this is originally has gone extinct and this is what's left. But over time, another speciation event occurred here. And whatever was here, okay, went on to become dentissima, but then a population went over here to become melanogaster, okay? Now, when we look at isolation, we're going to talk about two terms, prezygotic and postzygotic. Now, I think you can understand what pre, that means before, and post means after, but what is zygotic? Any chance you remember what a zygote is? This basically has to do with fertilization. When you have an egg and a sperm that fertilizes, that creates a zygote. So prezygotic is some type of isolation before reproduction. Postzygotic is some kind of isolation after reproduction. Now you may be saying, what difference does that make? Well, I think you'll get it, okay? Because the first type of isolation we'll talk about is called temporal isolation. Think of frogs are interesting. There's a species of frogs that live here in Florida, and they live right next to each other, but they are splitting apart. They're isolated because they reproduce at different times of the year. Some of them have a mating season in the late spring, some of them have a mating season in the late summer. And for whatever reason, who the heck knows, but for whatever reason, they're now isolated. They may as well be 1,000,000 miles apart. And that means that their DNA of these two, even though they're living right next to each other, it's two separate populations basically. And that's how it always works, two separate populations. Even though they're right next to each other, hopping around in the same lily pads or whatever floats around out there, because they reproduce at different times of the year, they are isolated from each other. They may as well be 1,000,000 miles apart. And eventually, because of the rules of mathematics and how DNA works, they will become so different, they will adapt and change and become so different from each other that they'll become their own species. That's happening right now in Lake Okeechobee. Another type of isolation, and by the way, this is before they reproduce, so it's called prezygotic. Another type of isolation is called mechanical isolation. Structural differences in the reproductive organisms lead to mechanical isolation. For example, plants may develop adaptations in the reproductive structures to attract specific pollinators. Okay, so now all of a sudden, same plant, but they live in two different areas, slightly different areas, and they change the way their flowers are shaped just a little bit, so much so that you might not even be able to tell. But to bees and birds, like hummingbirds, there's a huge difference. And so even though they're the same species, this population over here is attracting the bees, and this population over here is attracting the birds, the hummingbirds. That's a mechanical isolation. Something is just slightly different about the reproductive organs of these things, like the flowers. And so given enough time, because they've isolated from each other, they will adapt independently of each other, the species will, and they will slowly change enough that they become two new species. And notice how this works, this pattern, it's almost always the same thing. Two populations of the same species live in two different areas, or something's different about how they reproduce, and they become isolated from each other. One adapts one way, one adapts the other way. Next thing you know, you get two new species. Or sometimes it's actually 10 different species. But we'll talk about that. Behavioral isolation. We see this a lot in birds. Two populations different in reproductive behavior. For instance, birds in one region may have different mating calls than the same species in another region. Now, this isn't like the frogs. They're not living right next door to each other. Okay, the frogs don't access any particular mate. They're restricted from certain mates because of the time of the year. Okay, but they're living right next door to each other. That is isolation. In behavioral isolation, they're restricted from each other's particular potential mates because of their behavior, something about them, like their mating calls. Okay, if you live here, your mating call may be a certain type of whistle. And if you live here, you may adjust that because who knows? Maybe it's something you're eating. Okay, maybe the bugs taste different. I don't know. Maybe the sun hits you different. I don't know. But as a result, the two slightly different behaviors attract two slightly different mates, and as a result, you've got isolation. And isolation in the same species, just different populations, the isolation of the two populations leads to different levels of adaptation, and it can ultimately lead to speciation. Gametic isolation is the same thing. For some related species, the sperm and egg may come into contact, but they cannot fuse to form a zygote for whatever reason. The sperm may not be able to read the chemical signal sent by the egg. Now, this is interesting because these are related species. All right, and look, this is a northern meadowlark and this is a southern meadowlark. You probably see these flying around. I shot 1,000,000 of these when I was a kid with a BB gun. I'm not happy about it, but I did. All right, these are very close to each other. Okay, this is similar to a donkey and a horse, for example. They are so close to each other, extremely similar species, but they don't reproduce with each other because they have gotten different enough over time, made slight adaptations. I mean, look at the chest of this bird and the chest of this bird. It's different. They have adapted enough that their gametes, their eggs and their sperm, are no longer compatible, and as a result, they're becoming further and further apart. Now, post-zygotic isolation is something that happens to organisms after they're fertilized. Okay, we had two populations, but they're reproducing with each other because they are close enough to each other and migrate. But something happens, and we're going to go back to horses and donkeys. A horse and a donkey can reproduce. Now there has to be some rules. I think it has to be a male horse and a female donkey or something. But they produced a mule. Mules are sterile. They're wonderful. I love mules. I think they're amazing. And they work hard and all this stuff, but they can't have children. They're called a hybrid. Okay? And there are no populations of mules on the earth because they don't reproduce with each other. This organism will never have an offspring. Sad, isn't it? That's why it looks so sad. This organism will never have an offspring, therefore there's no population, therefore there's no reproduction. I said that backwards. There's no reproduction, therefore there's no population, therefore that's it. Post-zygotic isolation. It's done. We will never have mule evolution because mules don't reproduce. So we're going to go back to this idea of speciation. Now, so I've already told you what speciation is. It's when two separate, or one large population becomes two separate populations because they live in two slightly different environments. And I gave you the example, and I swear to you this is random chance, but it looks similar to what happened here. Look, you got one population of trees. I mean, if you think about that, you know, in my original, where did it go? Here's my original example, and I was talking about the birds, but how come these trees are different? What's on this side of the river versus this side of the river, and how come these are dark green and these are light green? Well, this could be why. All right, they were one population of trees, but then something happened, an earthquake or a landslide or something, and it caused the course of a river to change its flow, and all of a sudden there's a river flowing between them, makes some distance between them, and so now they become two separate species. This is called allopatric speciation. It occurs when a physical or geographical barrier separates a species and then a new species forms. You'll notice that this one on the left is the same species as original, but this one on the right has adapted and changed because it's now separate. It does not reproduce with the original bunch anymore, and so it's modifying itself and adapting and over time on its own. Okay, so as a result, you're going to see two slightly different species appear. It happens all the time. Do you know how many different pine trees there are just in the state of Florida? I think we have 17 different types of pine trees just in the state of Florida. This is how that happens. At one point there was a species of pine tree, but they've changed and adapted to the local environment so much that we now have, I don't know, I think it's 17. Somebody ought to look that up. This is called allopatric speciation because geographically there's something different about this side than there is this side. When they were together, then the genes were all being shared equally, okay? But when they got split apart, these genes stayed here and these genes stayed here, and any adaptations and mutations that occurred here did not get, if there was a mutation occurred here, it would eventually spread to the whole population. But now that we've got two populations, if there's a mutation, it only stays here, not comes over here. And so after a while they become different. Sympatric speciation is when the same kind of a thing occurs, but there's no physical or geographical barrier. There's something else that causes members of this, you know, the offspring of the species to be isolated from each other. You know, I don't know. This one's a little bit harder to understand, but there's some examples. Some insects underwent speciation because some of them changed the way they eat. We'll talk about a spider in a minute. Almost all spiders on Earth are carnivorous, but then all of a sudden there's this one spider that's a vegetarian. You know, go figure. And it changed its food source, and as a result, the local population of spiders that change their food source have now all of a sudden become a totally different species because they've adapted to this new type of eating. Orcas, or killer whales that live in the Pacific Northwest, did the same thing. They were just one big population of orcas, but these changed a little bit because there's a whole new diet and whole new social behavior emerged around hunting this food, and as a result they slightly changed. They still were intermingling with each other, but they something changed. They had access to each other, the larger population. Like these trees right here, the genes could have been spread to everything, the new mutations could have been spread to everything, but something kept it from happening, and that's called sympatric species. Okay, so now there's some, okay, there going to start all over. So now there are these patterns of evolution. And I want you to know about this because these are important. When we look at the history of the earth and we look at what they call natural history, and you do that by studying all kinds of things. One of the main things is fossil evidence. But when we look at living things versus what's no longer living but used to live here, etc., we can see these patterns of evolution. All right. For example, there's something called coevolution. During the time of the dinosaurs, there really weren't any flowers. Flowering plants weren't very common back then. They were just starting to appear. And the reason for that is because the plants had not evolved. They pollinated differently. You know, like the oak trees outside don't have flowers. They just have, so they pollinate differently. They allow the wind to pollinate. That's how things were originally pollinated. But then are all these insects that were kind of appearing. You know, even though it was the age of dinosaurs, it was also kind of the age of insects. And these insects appeared, and they, started crawling around. And when I say this, it sounds like there's an intelligence involved, but there really wasn't necessarily. But so when I say the trees figured it out, it was just random chance. But if all these insects are flying around, and look, they're all fuzzy, guess what's going to stick to them? The pollen. All of a sudden one day, a plant changed its reproductive structure a little bit so that the bee, or whatever the insect was back then, was like, whoa, what is that? Let's go check that thing out. And it attracted a pollinator. And that was the first flower. And that bee crawled around in there, smelled the nectar, maybe even saw the flower, and it was probably really small. But that bee was like, wow, man, look at this. And it's got food in it. I'm going to stick my face down in there and get all that nectar. And then it got the pollen all over the bee, or whatever it was back then. That bee flew to the next tree. And instead of pollinating through the wind, now this thing is pollinated through an insect. And it is a much more successful form of pollination. Well, over time, guess what? The bigger the flowers, the more nectar you produced, the greater the chance that the bees were going to come to you and eat the nectar and get your pollen all over them. And then you got a greater chance at being successful. So now all of a sudden we've got how many different kinds of flowers? And the sole purpose of a flower is to attract a pollinator. All right. Now I don't want to talk about bees, because what I really want to talk about is hummingbirds, because hummingbirds show coevolution much better. Let's look at that. So this is classic hummingbird coevolution. Now to co-evolve means that these things evolve together. This plant, this flower, and this hummingbird, and it may not have just been this flower, but flowers in general, evolved around each other. What do you notice about this flower? Something very different. Does this look like your normal flower? No. It's very deep, okay? And then of course, take a look at the hummingbird. One of the most distinctive features of the hummingbird is this ridiculous goofy looking beak. Now, if you could go back in time, thousands of generations ago for each one of these organisms, you would find flowers, these flowers were much shorter, and you would find a bird with a much shorter beak. But here's the deal. If you're the hummingbird, you want to get the nectar, right? If you're the flower, you want to get your pollen on the hummingbird. How do you do that? If you're the flower, how do you get the nectar for the hummingbird? You stick your beak down in there, and your tongue, really, it's weird if you ever look at it up close, sticks out the end, and eats up all the nectar. So if you got a long beak, you're going to do a better job. You're going to have a greater chance of getting more nectar. So what's the advantage here? To have a slightly longer beak? Okay. If my beak is really long, I'm going to get all the nectar, but the flowers aren't being as successful because their pollen is not getting on the bird's face. Okay. So what happens? And this is, you act like this is done. They get together and they talk about it, but that's not what happened. It just random natural selection. Now all of a sudden, the flowers move their nectar a little bit further back. The pollen still stays on the end, but the nectar goes further back. What's the bird got to do? It's got to have a long enough beak to jam its face all the way down in there and get that nectar at the back, okay, or they don't eat. So what happens to the short-billed hummingbirds? They die off, right? So right now, beaks got longer. Now, if the beaks get longer, what happened to the advantage of being a deeper cupped flower? It's gone, right? So now it happens all over again. The cups get deeper. So the hummingbird again's got to stick its face way down in there. Okay, well, again, back to the hummingbird. Guess what? The hummingbirds with the longest beaks eat the best. So guess what? The next generation, they all have long beaks. So next thing you know, 2 or 3 generations later, everybody's got a little bit longer beak. Starts all over again. The flowers get deeper, the beaks get longer, the flowers get deeper. And it only stops when you reach kind of something ridiculous. It's no longer an advantage to have such a long beak because you're trying to fly and you're dragging the thing through the dirt or something. So there's a maximum length of this beak that's efficient. There's a maximum depth of these cups that is sufficient. But this is called coevolution. Over time, the cups got deeper and the beaks got longer. And this happened with all kinds of species, all kinds of organisms. Just hummingbirds are the best example. Mutualism is when 2 species working together, it's a benefit for each other. Now, the truth is we can go right back to the same example, right? But we'll stick with the bees in this case. Is there an advantage for this bee to be climbing around this flower and getting this pollen all over it? Sure. What's the advantage? It gets to eat. So this species of bee right here, you're looking at 2 species, the bee and the flower. This species of bee has a huge advantage. It gets to get down in the flower and eat. Now, crazier, it does a whole lot more than just with the nectar. It gets the pollen, it does all kinds of things. And bees have learned over the years, they're very successful. They learned over the years how to do well with all kinds of parts of the flower. This is a pollen sac. It actually collects that pollen and takes it back and does something with it at the beehive. But it's an advantage for the bee because it gets to eat. What's the advantage for the flower? The flower gets its DNA spread around and the flower has a greater chance of being reproductively successful. Is it good for the bee? Good. Is it good for the flower? Excellent. This is a pattern of evolution called mutualism. Interestingly, there's another pattern of evolution called parasitism. Organisms evolve to be parasitic. Okay? They evolve to pull energy from something else. They have evolved, this is a tick by the way, they evolved the shapes of their body to where they are very good at draining energy from a host body. With parasitism, you have a host and a parasite. The parasite, actually I think these are headlights, aren't they? The parasites have evolved the shapes of their bodies so that they can do what they do, which is drain energy from the host. Okay? And this is not a coevolution thing. The host has not evolved to make it easier for in fact, the host usually evolves ways to avoid these. So there is kind of a coevolution going on there in that the host is trying to get rid of the parasite, but the parasite has to evolve to where it stays its ability to continue to eat off the host, or else it's going to go extinct, right? This is called parasitism. One of the best things you can understand about this is that the parasite gains while the host loses. Now, just a quick review, with mutualism, the bird and the flower, the bee and the flower, they both gained. This is good for the flower and it's good for the bee. With parasitism, it's good for the parasite, bad for the host. And there's one more. Even though they don't really talk about it, there is a type of relationship here called commensalism. I'm going to show you a picture of that. Here's an interesting type of evolution that is mostly evolution of behavior, but these birds are called cattle egrets. If you've lived in Okeechobee for any length of time, you've probably seen them. Okay, cattle egrets are very interesting because they have an advantage of being around the cattle, and it's this: they like to eat insects that live in this grass. They spend their day hunting the insects, but what they learned a long time ago, and this is behaviorally evolved. Their behavior evolved is what I'm trying to say, not necessarily the structures of their body, although a little bit. But they noticed a long time ago that as the cows are eating the grass, they are always walking forward and eating grass. That's how cows work. They eat, then they walk, they eat, then they walk. But the birds noticed that as their legs moved through the grass, it kicked up the bugs that they wanted. So the birds started staying around the cows. They'll even stand on the backs of the cows. Cows don't care. It's good for the bird because it helps. The birds are finding their food source a lot better. The cow is going to move through the grass whether the bird is there or not. But it's an advantage for the birds because they get to find the bugs better. It's an advantage for the birds, but it has no effect on the cattle. The cattle are going to do what they do in spite of the birds, whether the birds are there or not. And I've seen plenty of cases in which there's herds of cows where there's the birds around them and herds of cows where they're not. The cows are going to do what the cows are going to do. So it has no effect on the cows. All right, this is called commensalism. Commensalism, C-O-M-M-E-N-S-A-L-I-S-M. All right, but the birds gain something. The cows have no effect. All right, so that's another type of relationship. Okay, sorry about you seeing a quick. I don't know why it does that. All right, next thing we're going to talk about is something called adaptive radiation or divergent evolution. Now we've already talked about this, but we're going to give a name to it. Remember when I told you we had one species, populations of those species go to different places, okay? And as a result, you get two new species. This is called divergent evolution. The same population is diverging away from each other and becoming two different species. It's a pattern that looks like this. So this is this is divergent evolution. Pardon me. If we have an original population, doesn't really matter what, let's just say birds, okay, finches, because we're going to be talking about finches in 2 slides. So we have an original population of finches. They do exactly what had happened with these birds, okay? They came to a new place and they split into 2 new populations, and those new populations become new species. That is called divergent evolution. Notice that they were the same thing, and then some diverge this way and some diverge this way to create two new species, and as a result we get 2 new species added to from an original population. Okay, we had from 1 became 2, and we get 2 brand new species that came from the original population. So divergent evolution. All right, but this can actually happen more than from the original population. We can get more than just 2 in the right situations. The original population, different populations can leave. Okay, different populations can split apart and go to entirely different climates, entirely different areas, entirely different situations, and they can change so significantly that they become all new species themselves. And as a result, this is called adaptive radiation. And so now as a result, and the original population is still around. Just like here, the original population may still be around. So now we started with 1 species, now we have 3. Well, through adaptive radiation, which notice how they radiate away from the central original population. These new populations are radiating away. That's why I'm showing you this pattern, is so that you'll understand that the reason we name it adaptive radiation is because it radiates away from the center. We can get 5 new species plus the original population. This is exactly what happened with Darwin's finches. The original finch that lived on the mainland ate seeds, but as these seed-eating finches were blown over to the new islands, okay, I hope you remember that story, they landed on very different islands. Each island had a different predominant food source or a different need, and so these seed-eating finches still lived on the mainland, so they still exist, but the ones that ended up on this island adapted to eating leaves. The ones that moved to this adapted to eating insects. The ones that adapted to eating fruit, adapted to eating grubs, and adapted to using tools. And after that adaptation occurred long enough, they became entirely new species. These are now, they were all the original species, the original basic finch, but they adapted and changed so much that they're different from each other. None of these species can now interact with each other reproductively because they are totally different. Their DNA has changed so much that they're not compatible anymore. If the leaf-eating finch was to go back to the mainland, they would not be able to reproduce, or go over to the insect. It wouldn't be able to reproduce, even though they came from the original thing. This is why Darwin's finches are considered one of the most important examples of evolution, and it's because of this very thing right here. They are able to show how one species became all new species. This is called speciation, and this is how we get new shapes and new this. And if it happens enough, who knows what these can turn into? Given enough time, given enough adaptation, they may lose flight, They may start living in the water, and next thing you know, they're penguins. That's exactly how it happened somehow to penguins, is they used to be birds that could fly, but now they're birds that can't fly anymore and they can swim. But they're birds. Kind of weird, isn't it? Now, so far I've been talking to you about how organisms leave one area and go to the other. The birds in the original example that I gave you, they were, let's see, where'd they go? Well, I've lost them. The birds in the original example left because of their forest they lived in burned down, right? But sometimes you don't have to leave. Sometimes instead of you moving to a new environment, the environment you live in changes, okay? And there's lots of examples of that. Guess what? If the environment changes, you have to do, and this should be a class motto, okay? Because when the original, hold on, it's called adapt or die. When the original birds that I gave you the example of, I'm just going to find them. These original birds that I gave you an example of, they had to move to a new environment. They had to adapt because if they didn't adapt to this new environment, what's going to happen? They're going to die. This is why a seed-eating bird didn't do as well on this island that was full of insects. So the ones that couldn't adapt, they died. The ones that could adapt, they learned to eat insects. Okay? Same thing happened in all these islands. So moving to a new place means you have to adapt to the new place or you die. Interestingly enough, sometimes you don't have to move. Sometimes your environment changes around you. Okay? And as a result, that can lead to evolution too. Here are some woolly mammoths. The woolly mammoth evolved as a very large herbivore creature living in the cold areas of the world. Actually evolved during an ice age, so everything was cold. Now suppose all of a sudden it starts to warm up. What's going to happen to these woolly mammoths? They've got two choices, don't they? It's getting too hot to have all that fur. So either A, you adapt by losing all that fur and becoming something entirely different, a whole new species, or you die. So how did woolly mammoths become elephants? They adapted to a changing environment. They were standing in the same place. They hadn't moved. The environment changed. And here's some examples of that happening, or the environment changing. Everything. Organisms, large and small, need basic resources. Changing the environment can greatly result in the change of those resources and availability, and so you have to adapt to that change or you're gonna die. And it can be, elephants, woolly mammoths changing to elephants, squirrels changing how they eat, or bacteria. You know what the bacteria environment sometimes can be? Your body. How about that, right? Yeah, you got bacteria floating around your body. Sometimes they're making you sick. Now, we're not talking about viruses right now. Two very different things. Right now, we're talking about bacteria. Bacteria floating around in your body, man, the reason it's in your body is because it likes the environment. It's well suited for that environment. In fact, it has adapted and evolved to live in that environment and make you sick and kill you. But before it kills you, you spread it to some other people, right? Well, we figured out how to change the internal environment of our bodies a long time ago. This guy invented something called penicillin, and I love this story because the guy that invented penicillin, he treated my grandfather in World War II and saved his life, but that's a whole nother story. So all of a sudden, somebody says, hey, start taking this penicillin. This penicillin gets into your bloodstream and the internal environment of your body. It changes. The bacteria are like, oh my God, this is horrible. Guess what they do? They die, right? Except they don't all die. Some of them have the ability to adapt. Now, this didn't happen instantly, this didn't happen overnight, but slowly over time, if you had 10 billion bacteria in your body and taking penicillin killed 99.99999% of all those bacteria, did it kill 100%? No. How many did it leave? Let's just say 100. But guess what's special about those 100 bacteria? They had the specialized structures, the specialized DNA. They had the ability to adapt to the changed environment. And then they started to grow. And now, all of a sudden, instead of there being a whole bunch of like the original ones that were killed by the penicillin, the ones that were left grew and started to spread, and now all of a sudden they're resistant to penicillin. So you're sick again. Doctor says, oh, we'll just give you more penicillin. Well, it doesn't work. Why? Because what you're sick with is the bacteria that can survive the penicillin. They adapted to the changing environment. They didn't go anywhere. The environment changed and they adapted to it. There's a whole story about this. It's getting bad. Antibiotic resistance is a huge problem, but I don't think we're going into that right now. We'll talk about it later, I think. Here's an interesting one. I told you this earlier. All spiders are carnivores. They catch things and eat them, usually bugs. Sometimes things like bats and birds. Let me tell you something. Spider big enough to catch a bat and eat it, I don't want to live where that thing is. Okay. However, here's an interesting situation. Acacia plants, you've heard of the ants that live in the acacia trees, and they eat the little, there's these structures, I forget what they're called, it says it right here, but they eat these the Beltian bodies. The ants eat these Beltian bodies. Well, the acacia trees started growing crazy. There's a lot of acacia trees all of a sudden, and so now this spider, because something happened to its original, I think something happened to its original diet, or it was just easier because there's just a bunch of acacia trees. This spider learns to eat these Beltian bodies like the ants do. And as a result, over time, this population of the spider that was whatever it was, okay, started eating a vegetarian diet. It changed everything about its behavior, its body structure, its coloring. And as a result, it became a whole new species of, however you say that. It changed, adapting to the new environment. This is what evolution and natural selection is. And there's a whole new species of spider today because it adapted to living and being successful eating a vegetarian diet. Not that I ever want to do that. Unfortunately, there are some things that are happening today, and this is very recent. Like, you know, if life on Earth is 3.7 billion years old, imagine 200 years of 3.7 billion. It's a fraction. It's an unbelievably small amount of time, and yet humans are causing more damage in the last 200 years than it's unbelievable. We're suffering massive deforestation. Places where 3.7 billion minus 200, there were forests. Actually not, but a long time there were forests, and now all of a sudden we're just cutting them down like crazy. Guess what? Deforestation, habitat fragmentation, okay, and things like that are causing things like artificially causing reproductive isolation, which is leading to eventually to speciation. Now you may be thinking, well, Mr. Thomas, didn't you say speciation is a good thing? Well, it is if it's happening naturally, but in this case it's a reaction to a human caused problem, and it can lead to extinction rather than speciation. And so when we clear a path right down the middle of a forest, I've seen these like where they build a power line. You know, I'm sure you've seen this too. They have to build a power line, and I like electricity, so I'm glad they did it. But you can imagine that this used to be one big forest, but now they built right down the middle. They cut a big, huge, wide path, and that's for some species who don't want to venture from here to here anymore because of this big gap, because they're afraid they're going to get eaten or something. This is now habitat fragmentation. Let's say there's a bug. This bug used to be, the species of bug used to be able to go all over the place. But now when they cut that thing down the middle, the ones that got trapped over here, they're forever over here. The ones that got trapped over here, they're forever over here. That will lead to speciation. That's what one of the rules about natural selection is. And it'll probably be okay because bugs are incredibly resilient, but we find tons of species that are struggling because of the situation. And yes, they're adapting and changing, but can they adapt and become a species that is suited to living in this new, smaller environment? Or what's the other option? If they can't adapt, they die. And what do we call when a species dies? That's right, it's called extinction. So deforestation is a problem. Pollution is a problem. Okay, we find evidence of fish that are becoming tolerant. Their genes are changing to create tolerant fish to this pollution. That's a good thing, right? Well, it's good that these things can become tolerant to the pollution, but you know, it's not a good thing that pollution's there. It just shows you how powerful evolution is that they can adapt to these kinds of things. But it does imply, and this is the important thing, this does imply that environmental changes can factor into the evolution of species. There is a species of fish that lives in Newark Bay, New Jersey, a very polluted, toxic waste site. There's a new species of fish that's never been there before. And this means that since man has been polluting the Newark Bay, which is just what, maybe 40 years, that this species of fish has emerged, has evolved to be tolerant of the pollution. So go figure that. Of course, climate change, the idea that the earth is warming. If the earth is warming, then places that used to be cold are now warm, used to be places that are warm now hot, for example, then that's a change in the environment, and things are going to have to evolve to that. Things are going to have to change and adapt to that. And it's a struggle. And the reason we're bringing this up is because what if they can't change? Then they're going to go extinct. And we're seeing extinction happening right now at a rate we haven't seen for millions of years, and it's never been caused by humans. But right now we're seeing extinctions happening so often that it's called the Anthropocene. Humans are causing so many extinctions on an annual basis, and it's just simply because of the stuff we're doing to the earth. The climate is changing, organisms are dying. What used to be totally frozen solid is now thawing. Things that lived on this ice, in, under, and around this ice, and survived on this ice, and that's what they do. You may think they're crazy, but them, they think that you're crazy. This is where I live. I live on the ice. You're the one that lives where there ain't no ice. What's wrong with you? But what happens one day if the ice goes away, or a lot of the ice goes away? Same kind of a thing. You adapt or die. Hopefully you can adapt, but if you can't, you're going to die. And the thing is for every one that adapts, there's probably at least one, maybe two that are dying. So we're losing species. So when these environments change because of what humans do, we're seeing, instead of speciation, we're seeing extinction. We're seeing both, but the extinction is more common. Now, the environment can cause group behavior. This is kind of found in your higher organisms. One example of the highest form of evolution is usually behavioral change. Okay, pack hunting, for example, is a behavior. And now these organisms evolved, these wolves evolved to, the shapes of their bodies are now pack hunters. They found out, and this is normal, this has nothing to do with humans, this happened long before humans. These organisms evolved to learn that as a behavior, if they hunted together, that they would be more successful, so they started hunting together. And now they've evolved to where that's just part of their lifestyle, part of what they are pack hunters. And we have lots of examples of group behavior. We have birds that flock together. Now, why do birds flock together? For the same reason that fish school together and elephants herd together. There's safety in numbers. There's success in numbers. Birds flocking together, they are better at hunting and finding food. If you are a bird and you happen to get lucky and fly into a swarm of insects, you're just like, oh my god, this is great. But you're not going to eat all these insects. And you do well, but the species may not do well. But when birds flock together and they fly into a large body of insects, they're like, oh my gosh, look, where the whole species is doing well. It's the same thing with schooling. Schooling has lots of advantages. It helps them hunt better. They're hunting for their food. But it also confuses the predator species. The predator looks at this and sees one big fish as opposed to a bunch of small fish. And so there's lots of advantages. It also increases the chance of them finding a mate. Herding has the same types of things. Herding animals protect their young better. They can survive rapid changes like freezing rain or snow. They can survive it better. There's just lots of things that they can do to help each other. So they've learned this pack behavior. They're more successful. Orcas hunt in groups just like the wolves do. It's better to migrate in packs. This is what I love about this one. It's better to migrate in flocks or something. But watch this. I'm sure you've looked up in the sky before and seen this, but these are geese. They are migrating, and they fly hundreds or thousands of miles. They flap their wings and they fly for hundreds or thousands of miles. Here's something that and I don't know how they did this, but they figured it out. The lead bird is not the bird in charge. Okay, there's no, I don't think there's any structure like that here. They change all the time. This bird flying in the front will fly this way for a length of time, 30 minutes, hour, I don't know, and then it will fall back into the very back, and the next bird moves up and becomes the lead bird for a while. Why? It has to do with aerodynamics. And you'll notice how they are flying in a particular V pattern, and it happens all the time. coming off of this bird's nose is cutting through the air in front of it, and it's pushing the air out of the way, and the air is coming out of the way in this exact shape, and it's making, this bird is working very hard to push the air out of the way, but as it pushes it out of the way, it makes it easier for this bird to fly, and it makes it easier for this bird, and then easier for this bird, because it's already pushed the air out of the way. So these birds fly in this V pattern because it's far more efficient. Yes, this bird has to do its share for about, I don't know, 30 minutes, then it falls back and the next bird does it, and they are sharing the work of flying through the air by flying in this V pattern. And that's crazy, isn't it? I mean, that's just absolutely insane. So migration is more efficient because they migrate together. And swarming is the same kind of a thing. Swarming benefits each other in lots of ways. They find food better, they can communicate better. Lots of reasons why organisms work together in groups. Now, normally I don't help you on these questions, but on this one I want you to think about it. This is the location. This is the northern location of the birds originally. The ring-billed gull, the American goldfinch, and the boreal chickadee. This is where their northern living. They migrate from here. They migrate south, and then they come back to here. But over time, guess what's happened? Over time, these three species of birds, instead of landing here in just outside of Louisiana and Mississippi, they come all the way up here to Kentucky for the ring-billed gull, the ring-belled gull. The American goldfinch used to be in southern Missouri. Now it's in northern Missouri and Illinois. The boreal chickadee used to be in southern Canada, and now it migrates much further north and west into central Canada. Here's something that I will tell you, and you have to figure out why. It's asking why this is happening, but I will tell you this. In each case, okay, it is cooler now here. It suggests that this was cool enough and now it's no longer cool enough, and that this is cool enough. What are they saying that this migration pattern change, what are they saying is causing this? It was cool enough here and it's no longer cool enough here. Now it's here. All of these things are moving north to cooler areas over time. What's causing that? Now, we've talked about extinction. Just want to show you that we've had lots of mass extinctions. Extinctions occur for lots of reasons. There's always what we call background extinction. Naturally, if humans weren't here, we would have a certain number of species go extinct every year. Sometimes we have what we call punctuated extinction. At the end of the Permian period, about 250 million years ago, almost 96% of all species died out. Now keep in mind, there weren't no humans around, and so this wasn't caused by humans. Extinction occurs naturally, but so there's always what we call gradual background extinction. Okay, things are always going extinct. Hopefully, and if you were to study ecosystems, you would know what a niche is, and as you know, whatever filled that niche in the ecosystem goes extinct, something new evolves to fill the niche. That's just the way ecosystems work. So as something goes extinct, hopefully there is something new coming along to fill the niche. All right. And then at times, like at the end of the Permian, there was that meteor impact that killed off 96% of all species. That just happens. So then there's a recovery period. Those are the two types of natural extinction. Sadly, there is another type of extinction that is caused by man, and that's what caused this bird. It's called a dodo bird. This bird went extinct because humans hunted it to extinction. For no other reason. It was doing fine until humans came along and decided we're going to kill all these. I don't know. I mean, I don't mind hunting. I like to hunt, but I don't go hunt the easy stuff. That's why they killed these, because they were big and stupid and slow. Well, let's kill them. They're easy to kill. It's fun. That's kind of dumb if you ask me, but you know, I don't have a problem with hunting down something that's challenging, but this is difficult. Or this was easy. They're gone. There will be no more dodos ever, ever, ever again. And they did not go extinct naturally. They went extinct because of the actions of humans. So that's the difficult kind of extinction. All right. When the mass extinctions occurred that killed off the dinosaurs, that killed, you know, we've had, I think there was, up until now, there were 6 mass extinctions caused by something happening in nature. Climate shifts, the volcanic eruptions, comets hitting. There's all kinds of things called these mass extinctions. Sadly, right now we're in the middle of the 7th mass extinction, and it's being caused by yours truly. I'm doing it. Me, Dan Thomas. Actually, no. You're doing it too. Humans, all humans are causing the seventh mass extinction, and that's not natural. And it's something we really should work towards stopping. Okay. All right. So humans can also adapt, just like any species on Earth. We're no different. We're just another species on Earth. We can adapt. Now, if you believe evolution, our ancestors, 5 million years ago, 10 million years ago, were really hairy. They had lots of hair covering them, right? And that was because they lived outside. When we started living indoors and draping ourselves in some type of clothing, whether it was a skin or something, whatever, we no longer needed all that fur to keep us warm, and so as a result, started losing our fur, right? We adapted. I watched this video, and this thing was awesome. Okay, watch this video because it shows you how today humans are adapting. There's these fishermen from Thailand. They swim underwater all day long and they hunt for food, and they had to adapt the way their eyes work underwater, and it happened. Adaptation of humans is happening today. It's a great video. Change the screen a little bit so that you can't see the sample answer at the bottom, but here's a great question. What else could be happening to humans today that's causing a genetic variation, or it's caused by a genetic variation, something slightly different about humans, okay, that is causing us to be able to adapt to an environment? Think about all the humans and think about the things that are different. Tall, short, light skin, dark skin, light eyes, blue eyes, whatever. And think about that and think about how it could be a positive adaptation or a positive variation. Tall and short people. Can you think of a situation in which being tall is an advantage? How about in a situation in which being tall would be a disadvantage? That's a hard one. Okay. Now don't do height, do something else, but that's what we're talking about. Are humans adapting and changing today? Of course we are. Okay, now we're better at adapting our environment to change. We change the environment now instead of the environment changing us, which is a really new thing. But we still have to adapt. If we go to Antarctica, we're not going to warm up all of Antarctica to be just like it is in sunny South Florida. We can build little boxes that we keep warm, but we still have to go outside. So guess what? People in Antarctica have slightly different adaptations than people who live in Florida. That's what this question is about. And that's the end of it, everybody. We have now finished the environmental impacts on evolution. By the way, this is the end of our evolution unit, and you've lived through it. You didn't die. And what I want you guys to do is get done. We're not through. I'm very sorry. Next week we're going to talk more about evolution. I shouldn't have said that. Next week we'll be talking more about evolution, but we are through with all of this stuff in Admentum for evolution, and I'm going to try to get you guys ready for the unit test. All right, we're done. Get to work. Thank you.